Chapter 10, Parts C and D of Aces Up. Aces Up by Covington, Clarke. Chapter 10, Parts C and D. Part C. The day following, Major Cowan called, and in his elation over the success of American arms at the recent Battle of Chateau Thierry, told McGee more in a short half-hour than Red had been able to worm from all others with whom he had talked. The Germans, Cowan told him, had been stopped at Chateau Thierry in an epic stand made by the 2nd and 3rd Divisions AEF, and a few days later the Marines had crowned themselves with a new glory when, in liaison with the French, they had stormed the edges of Belleau Wood, gained a foothold, and then tenaciously pushed slowly forward in the bloodiest and bitterest battle yet waged by the untried American forces. Counterattack after counterattack had been met and repulsed, with the net result that the Germans had been definitely stopped in the Marne salient. Their hope of breaking through to Paris was shattered, and though they were still pounding hard, their sacrifices were vain. It was, Cowan declared, the real turning point of the war, and even now men were joyously declaring that the war would be won by Christmas. As for the air forces, they had delivered beyond the fondest hopes of the High Command. The casualties had been high, Cowan admitted, but not higher than might be expected, and not without giving even heavier losses to the enemy. The squadron losses could have been held down had the members been less keen about scoring a personal victory over von Herzmann. Every pursuit pilot along the entire front was willing to take the most desperate chances in the hope of plucking the crest feathers of this German war eagle. "I guess there's one member not particularly anxious to pluck any of the eagle's feathers," McGee put in at this point. "No?" Cowan's voice was quizzical. "Who's that?" "Siddons," McGee replied tersely. A look of aggravation or of pained tolerance crossed Cowan's face. "We won't discuss that," he said, deserting for the moment his air of good fellowship and returning to the quick, testy manner of speaking which was so characteristic of him in matters of decision. "I take it you have said nothing to Larkin, or anyone else, concerning our suspicions?" "Nothing, sir. But I can't—" "Good. Let intelligence work it out, Lieutenant. One little rumor might upset all their plans. I can assure you, however, that G2 knows all that you know. They are waiting the right minute, and perhaps have some plan in mind. Silence and secrecy are their watchwords. Let them be yours." He arose and extended his hand. "I must be moving along. I'm glad to see you doing so nicely. You'll be more than welcome when you get back to the squadron. Don't worry, there's plenty of war left yet." Part D. Perhaps there was plenty of war left, but McGee soon discovered that a badly broken arm and a cracked, cut head can be painfully slow in healing. Days dragged slowly by, with Larkin's visits as the only bright spot in the enforced inactivity. Then, to McGee's further distress, the squadron was moved to another front. Larkin had been unable to tell him just where they were going, but believed it was to the eastward, where it was rumored that Americans were to be given a purely American sector. This was unpleasant news to McGee. It meant that he would be left behind, and he could not drag from the hospital medicos any guess as to when he would be permitted to leave the hospital. Hospital life, with its endless waiting, sapped his enthusiasm. At night, in the wards, the men recovering from all manner of wounds would try to speed the lagging hours by telling stories, singing songs, and inventing the wildest of rumors. Occasionally, when the lights were out, some wag would begin an imitation of a machine gun, with its rat-tat-tat-tat, and another, catching the spirit of the mimic warfare, would make the whistling sound of a high-angle shell. In a few moments the ward would be a clamorous inferno of mimic battle sounds. Machine guns popping, shells screaming toward explosion, cries of gas, and the simulated agonized wails of the wounded and dying. "Hit the dirt! Here comes a GI can! Look out for that flying pig! Over the top, my buckos, and give 'em the bayonet!" Thus did men, wrecks in the path of war, keep alive their spirit and courage, by jesting over the grimmest tragedy that had ever entered their lives. And then they would take up rollicking marching songs, or sing dolefully, "I want to go home, I want to go home." Invariably, when some chap began a narrative of the prowess of his own company or regiment, the others would begin singing tauntingly, "The old gray mare, she ain't what she used to be, ain't what she used to be, ain't what she used to be. The old gray mare, she ain't what she used to be many long years ago." It wasn't really fun. It was only the pitifully weak effort to meet suffering, loneliness, homesickness, and fear with bravado. There is no one in all the world more lonely than a soldier in a hospital. Time becomes what it really is, endless and without hope of a change on the morrow. And the pay for it all was a gold wound chevron to wear on the sleeve, or a dangling, glittering medal testifying to courage and sacrifice. End of Chapter 10, Parts C and D. Chapter 11, Part A of Aces Up. Aces Up by Covington Clarke. Chapter 11, Part A. The Ace and the Spy. So slow was McGee's recovery that it was the middle of September before he received his final discharge from the hospital and was given orders to rejoin his old squadron, now operating in the St. Mihiel salient. 3 days prior to his release, the American Army, operating on a purely American front, had attacked the Germans in the St. Mihiel salient with such determined vigor, and the entire preparation conducted with such successful secrecy, as to take the Germans by complete surprise, overrun all opposition, and recover for France many miles of territory long held by the invaders. Thousands of prisoners and arms of all caliber were captured in the swift stroke, and all France was ringing with praise of the endeavor. News of the progress of the battle reached McGee just before his final discharge. He entertained high hopes of rejoining the squadron in time to participate in the Feast of Victory, but by the 15th, 3 days after the battle was begun, the salient had been pinched out and the battle won. On the 16th, when McGee reached Ligny and Barras, which had served as General Pershing's field headquarters at the beginning of the operation, he found that his squadron had been withdrawn from the sector and sent somewhere else. Where? No one seemed to know. Furthermore, no one seemed to care a great deal. A pilot lost from his squadron, or a soldier lost from his regiment, was no new thing in France. It happened daily. Men were discharged from hospitals, ordered to a certain point to rejoin their commands, only to discover on reaching there that the outfit had seemingly vanished in thin air. McGee spent a full day trying to find someone with the correct information as to the location of the squadron. At last, an officer on the general staff looked over McGee's papers and gave him a transportation order to a little town west and south of Verdun. "Is my squadron there, sir?" McGee asked. "They should be," the officer replied, "at least near there." And he closed the conversation as though that were quite enough for any pilot to know. But when McGee reached the town, part of the journey being by rail and part by motor lorries, he found himself as completely lost as possible. Again, no one seemed to know anything about the squadron. His search was made doubly difficult by the fact that there was an unusual air of activity. All the troops seemed to be on the move, and officers were far too busy with their own cares to listen to the troubles of a lost aviator. That night McGee watched 2 or 3 regiments pass through the town, fully equipped for battle. It came to him suddenly that all this activity and night marching could mean only one thing: a new attack along some new front. Encouraged by the success of Saint-Mihiel, the Americans were going in again. But where? McGee put the question to a dozen officers, and not one of them had the foggiest notion of where he was going. This served all the more to convince McGee that a new operation was being secretly planned by great headquarters, and from the many different divisional insignias which he had noticed, he felt convinced that it would be a major offensive. So, without displaying any lights whatsoever, the men and motors moved ever forward along the muddy road. The rain ceased as suddenly as it had come. The night was warm, for September, and gray fog wraiths began rising from the ground. The sweating horses, straining at the big heavy guns at the side of the road, were blanketed in steam. The traffic on the pitch-black road was becoming increasingly heavy, and now and again halts were made until someone, far ahead, succeeded in working out the snarl. Then the troops would move forward again. McGee no longer had any doubts concerning what was in store for these thousands upon thousands of men, but he was beginning to question the wisdom of his own move. He made no attempt to engage anyone in conversation, fearing that it would result in some officious commander ordering him to the rear. Far ahead, against the black night sky, flashes of gunfire showed now and then, the following thunder establishing the fact that the front was within 3 or 4 hours marching time. The gunfire, however, was not heavy, being merely the spasmodic firing incident to such nights as communiques spoke of as calm. After another hour of marching, McGee noticed that they were on the edge of a shattered village. Not one single wall stood intact. As he reached the center of this stark skeleton of a once happy village, he saw that here the enemy had concentrated their fire. Here was a wall, standing gaunt and grim against the night sky, and over there, facing a little square, a shattered church still retained the strength to hold aloft its cross-capped steeple, the cross in a broken, blood-red world. McGee slowed his pace gradually and dropped from the line of march. He had considered himself fully recovered, but the last hour had sapped his small reserve of strength. He seated himself on a pile of stone in the dark corner of a protecting wall and wiped his brow. What with the long, hot march and the steam rising from the soaked earth, he was wringing wet. The experience had served to increase his respect for these plodding doughboys who considered this as only one more night like dozens of others they had experienced. Sitting there on the damp, cold stone, McGee considered his position. This town, battered by shell fire, would be forward of any position taken up by a pursuit group. To push on would be but to retrace his steps. It would also be folly, for he had no gas mask. Shells had reached this town before, and they might do so again. He was willing to take a chance with flying shrapnel, but deadly gas was something else again. He decided, therefore, to make his way to the edge of the town, find shelter if possible, and await the coming of dawn. Daylight, he reasoned, would be certain to bring him in sight of planes from some group operating on this front, and if he could locate a drome, his problem would be near solution. He made his way back along the lines of infantrymen, artillery, ambulances, and wagon trains, until he reached an old stone stable that had miraculously escaped destruction. Having no light, he groped around in the black interior, seeking a place where he might spread his coat for a bed. He stumbled against a ladder, which mounted upward into the cavernous maw of a loft. He climbed the creaking rungs, found footing on the dry floor, and stopped to sniff at the odor of the few wisps of dry, musty hay scattered thinly over the rough boards. He took a step forward, stumbled over a pair of legs, and landed head first on the stomach of another sleeper. Whoosh went the escaping breath of that truant soldier, followed by an angry outpouring of abuse. "Say, soldier, get your foot out of my face. What do you think this is, a football game?" "Pipe down," came a gruff voice from another corner. "Do you want some smart Louie to come up here and chase us out?" McGee smiled, wondering what would be their reaction should he announce that a Louie was even now in their presence. Perhaps it was his duty as an officer to rout them out and order them to rejoin their commands, but he felt no responsibility for these men of the line, and if they were as weary and sleepy as he, and doubtless they had more reason to be, then he could hardly blame them for falling out. With the morning, he knew these army-wise soldiers would go down the road until they found their outfits, and there pour forth a plausible lie about becoming lost in the tangle and how they had searched all night for their company. McGee knew little enough about the American infantrymen, but he did know that for tricks that are vain, Bret Harte's famous heathen Chinese had nothing on the average soldier of the line, be he American, English, French, or a black man from Senegal. Cautiously he felt out a clear space, spread his coat over the rough timbers, and was soon sound asleep. End of chapter 11, part A.